It started with a letter, an inheritance from a man I never met, and a house that was never meant to be opened. Inside the Durnham estate, time had stopped, and behind one sealed wall, I found what no one was ever supposed to see. She wasn't a ghost. She wasn't a rumor. She was a child, forgotten by history, buried by silence. And for 93 years, the world pretended she never existed. Until now, this is her story and mine. The letter arrived on a Tuesday morning, sealed in an aged envelope with brittle corners and handwriting so precise it felt like it belonged to another century. I remember staring at it longer than I should have, the weight of it oddly heavy in my palm, like it carried more than just ink and paper. It carried time's secrets and some invisible hand of fate. I had never heard of the Durnham family, and yet there it was. My name, Samuel Thorne, written in cursive across the front, addressed with formality that didn't match the world I lived in. I opened it slowly, cautiously, like it might disappear if I moved too fast. The words were clear, emotionless. I had inherited the Durnham estate from a great-uncle named Silas Durnham, deceased with no other living descendants. The letter stated I was the last remaining blood relative, the legal heir to a property I had never visited, from a man whose name was absent from every corner of my childhood. I sat in silence for a long time after reading it, the sound of the city muffled beyond the cheap apartment windows that had framed my life for the past 8 years. I was raised by the state, fostered by a parade of indifferent guardians and their rotating list of rules, expectations, and quiet resentments. Love was conditional, belonging was fleeting, and identity, well, identity was something I stitched together from borrowed habits and half-remembered smiles. And now, suddenly, a thread had been handed to me, something ancient and undeniable. Blood, lineage, a place. I read the letter a second time, then a third, searching for mistakes, wondering if there had been some mix-up in records or a cruel joke played with impeccable detail. But the letter included documentation, property deeds, a faded photo of the estate taken sometime in the 1950s, and a lawyer's business card clipped to the corner with a paper clip rusted from decades of pressure. That night, I lay awake in bed staring at the ceiling, listening to the hum of the refrigerator and the muffled arguments from the apartment above. I thought about Silas Durnham, who he was, why I had never reached out, and why I had been chosen. I thought about roots, about the ache I'd carried since childhood, that soft and constant hunger to belong somewhere, anywhere. The estate, I told myself, could be nothing. It could be dust and memories, a decaying structure barely holding together in some forgotten part of the country. But it was mine, and in that truth was a sense of control I had never known. I imagined driving up a long gravel path, unlocking a heavy oak door, and walking into a house that didn't just belong to me, but that I belonged to. That fantasy haunted me more than any nightmare. Over the next few days, I made arrangements, quit my job at the university archives where I'd been cataloging old library donations, packed my books, clothes, and the few belongings that had followed me from apartment to apartment. I didn't tell anyone where I was going. Who would I tell? I had no close friends, no partner, no parents to call with the news. There was only me and the echo of a last name I didn't know how to carry. When I arrived at the estate, after a 9-hour drive north into the fog-heavy countryside, I wasn't prepared for what I saw. The Durnham estate sat like a monument carved from grief itself. 3 stories of stone and wood, its windows tall and narrow like watchful eyes, the paint on the shutters peeled into brittle curls. Ivy climbed up one side like it had been trying to consume the structure for years and nearly succeeded. The air smelled of damp earth and something older, something sour and metallic, like rust and forgotten time. I stood there for a long time with the engine ticking behind me and the keys cold in my hand. The house didn't feel welcoming, but it didn't feel hostile either. It felt waiting. I stepped inside and the air shifted. The wooden floors creaked under my boots, the kind of creak that sounded less like wood settling and more like breath held in tension. Dust motes swam in the angled sunlight, cutting through stained glass above the foyer. Every surface was covered with a film of time. Furniture draped in sheets, portraits yellow with age, and stacks of books that seemed too precisely placed to be the result of clutter. There were no personal effects, no photographs, no signs of recent life. The house felt paused, like someone had left mid-sentence and never returned to finish the thought. I began to explore, careful with every step, every touch. There was a library with tall shelves that curved into the ceiling, a grand piano in a parlor room whose keys had long since surrendered to silence, and a dining room set for a meal that had never been eaten. Crystal glasses dusted and cracked, plates arranged with sterile precision. But the strangeness wasn't in the decay. It was in the order. Everything was frozen in place, like a museum installation designed to evoke memory, without offering any. That night, I couldn't sleep. I kept the lights on, the old chandelier above the grand staircase flickering as though reacting to my thoughts. I kept hearing things, not voices, not footsteps, just shifts. The kind of sounds that made you question if you'd really heard them at all. My bedroom overlooked the back gardens, or what used to be gardens, now just tangled hedges and trees reaching in too close to the windows. I thought about Silas Durnham, tried to picture him wandering these halls, placing objects just so, preparing this house for something or someone. I thought about the years, the decades he had lived alone here, and the decision to never reach out to family, to never leave. Why now? Why me? I couldn't shake the feeling that the house wasn't just offering itself to me. It was asking something in return. The next morning, I began going through the documents left in the study, a room filled with old wooden filing cabinets, ledgers, and typed letters on yellowing pages. I wasn't sure what I was looking for. Maybe history, maybe proof. But as I sifted through the past, I realized I wasn't just archiving this place. I was stitching into myself, thread by thread. There were letters dated back to the 1920s, bills for construction, newspaper clippings about local fairs, and one peculiar document, a blueprint of the house that didn't match the layout I had seen. There was a hallway on the first floor that no longer existed, a room labeled East Nursery that had no door. I circled it in red ink and pinned it to the corkboard. That's when I noticed a sealed door, flush against the wallpaper in the east wing, almost invisible if you didn't know to look. No handle, no hinges, just the faintest outline, like a memory trying to hide. I touched it and felt a chill crawl up my arm. I told myself it was just air, old wood and cold stone. But I knew, deep in my bones, that whatever was behind that wall was the reason I had come here. Not by accident, not by inheritance, but by necessity. The estate wasn't just mine now. It had claimed me. And in that realization was the first stir of unease, of knowing that what we inherit isn't always a gift. Sometimes it's a burden shaped like a home, waiting for someone desperate enough to open the door. The morning after discovering the sealed door, I walked to the Durnham estate with a new kind of caution. Not the kind born from fear of harm, but the slow and reverent kind, like walking through a sacred site you don't yet understand, where every creak of the floorboards feels like a whisper, and every shadow carries the weight of unspoken memory. The house was awake now, not in the supernatural sense, but in the emotional one, as if by simply acknowledging that something was hidden, I had disturbed a carefully maintained silence. I began methodically exploring the estate room by room, documenting what I found with the same diligence I once gave to manuscripts in the university archives. Only now, I wasn't cataloging books. I was cataloging a life, many lives, possibly, and try and make sense of the silence they left behind. The library, for instance, was pristine, its leather-bound volumes arranged alphabetically, but with peculiar gaps, whole letters missing from the shelves, like someone had removed all books by authors whose last names started with G, N, and V. The gaps weren't random, I was certain of it, but what logic had governed their removal, I couldn't tell. Then there was a studies globe, an ornate piece with hand-painted countries that no longer existed, its surface worn along a narrow band that suggested it had been spun obsessively, always stopping somewhere near Eastern Europe. There was a broken clock in the upstairs hallway that pointed forever to 4:19, a time that began to repeat in my head until it felt like a kind of secret code. And every room had a mirror, but they were all covered with sheets, heavy velvet drapes, or, in some cases, wooden boards nailed in place. I left them that way. There was something about this silence that didn't want to be disturbed by reflection. I kept a notebook tucked in my back pocket, scribbling down every detail, every oddity, like a detective rather than an heir. As I moved deeper into the house, I found entire wings that looked untouched by time, rooms with immaculate furniture, dusted corners, and curtains still tied in elegant bows, as if someone had prepared them for guests that never came. But these rooms didn't feel inviting. They felt staged, artificial, like sets built for a performance no one ever watched. The walls were thick, and I began to notice inconsistencies. Doorways that led to shorter hallways than they should, rooms that seemed smaller on the inside than their outer walls suggested. I started measuring, sketching, comparing my drawings to the old blueprints I found. There was no doubt. The estate had been altered. Rooms had been removed, sealed off, or shrunk, and not in any logical pattern. More like someone was trying to confuse future inhabitants, to create a labyrinth of memory and loss. I returned to the sealed door in the east wing and sat beside it, listening. Not for sounds, I knew better than to expect that, but for feeling. The air there was colder, stiller, and it carried a faint smell of plaster and something organic, something like old wood mixed with fabric that had never seen sunlight. I traced the outline of the door with my fingers, following it like a scar. I didn't try to break it down. Not yet. There was a patience in me I hadn't known before, like I understood instinctively that rushing this would ruin everything. So I waited, I explored, and I wrote. One afternoon, in the upper attic, I found a box labeled S. Durnham, Personal Effects. Inside were ledgers, letters addressed but never sent, and one faded photograph of a young man standing beside the estate's front door. Silas Durnham, I assumed. His expression caught somewhere between pride and pain. There was also a collection of journal pages, not bound, just loose sheets, some stained with what might have been ink or water damage. The handwriting was clean, angular, and filled with references to the child, always in lowercase, never named. One entry described days of stillness interrupted by weeping. Another, the necessity of discipline for clarity of spirit. It was disturbing, not in a sensational way, but in the cold detachment of it. Whoever had written these words had done so with the conviction of someone who believed cruelty could be justified by logic. I stared at the page for a long time. The phrase, "We do not speak in this house," underlined 3 times, before folding it carefully and placing it in my notebook. That night, I sat in the dining room, candlelit, the grand chandelier above casting long, skeletal shadows on the tablecloth. I tried to imagine what dinners were like here, who sat at this table, what they talked about, if they talked at all. The silence had a shape now, a character. It wasn't the absence of noise. It was the presence of something withheld. I started noticing things I hadn't seen before. Tiny scratches near the baseboards, as if something had been dragged across the floor repeatedly. Faint discolorations in the wallpaper like handprints that had been scrubbed away, and a series of small holes drilled into one wall that looked too precise to be random. Everything pointed to a house that had been carefully modified to keep something or someone in and the rest of the world out. I found myself thinking about my childhood in the system, the locked doors, the rules, the way silence was often the only language spoken when shame or pain filled a room. I knew what was to be hidden, even if my version was more metaphorical than physical. That shared language made me feel closer to this place, as if I was being led, not by ghosts or visions, but by the emotional echoes of lives lived in captivity. I began to dream of the house. In my dreams, I was not myself but someone else, shorter, younger, moving through hallways with bare feet and careful steps. The dreams were silent, always silent, but thick with emotion, fear, resignation, and something softer, like hope dulled by time. I would wake with tears on my face and a deep ache in my chest that I couldn't explain. The house wasn't haunting me. It was remembering itself through me. One morning, I discovered a box hidden beneath a loose floorboard in the master bedroom closet. Inside were drawings, childlike, uneven, rendered in crayon and charcoal. Some were simple: a sun, a tree, a house with 4 windows and no door. Others were more complex, disturbing even: a figure in a chair behind bars, another a large eye watching from the ceiling, and one that made my stomach turn. A girl, her mouth an empty circle, standing in a room full of clocks with no hands. I didn't know who had drawn them, but I knew they were real, that they were expressions of something lived. I laid them out on the bed and stared at them for hours. This wasn't just a house with secrets. It was a house built from secrets shaped by them. And now I had stepped into it architecture, like a trespasser who had been mistaken for family. The estate no longer felt like an inheritance. It felt like a confession, one long and winding and buried beneath layers of tradition, shame, and silence. And I, once a man with no past, now carried too much of it. I began to speak aloud, narrating my thoughts as I walked the halls, not to fill the silence, but to challenge it. "I see you," I whispered once to the sealed door, and for a moment I felt like it heard me, not in the ghostly way, but in the psychological sense that the house was a reflection of Silas Durnham's mind, and by inhabiting it, I was slowly unraveling his logic, his design, his madness. And in doing so, I was unraveling myself. But I couldn't stop. The pull was too strong, the need to understand too deep. Somewhere behind these walls was a truth, ugly, old, and buried, but I was determined to bring it into the light, no matter what it cost me. Because once you've been silent your whole life, the chance to speak, even through someone else's history, is too powerful to ignore. I began to lose track of time inside the Durnham estate, not because the days moved faster, but because the house seemed to bend the hours, stretching in the quiet until each minute felt suspended in the air like dust and light, present, still, weightless, and yet full of consequence. My days blurred into one another, not from monotony, but from a growing sense that I was unraveling something vast and deliberately tangled, a web spun not by one man, but by generations of silence layered over with intent. I spent each morning in the study, poring through old files and writing my findings into journals I kept for clarity. But the more I uncovered, the less clear things became, as if the house gave only what it wanted me to see and always at a cost. It began with the discovery of a blueprint older than the one I had first found, tucked behind the lower drawer of a side cabinet. This one stained, the corner singed as though someone had tried to destroy it. But the ink remained legible, and in this version, the house had more rooms, more hallways, and two sets of stairs that no longer existed, one of which led to what was once a lower basement that had since been filled in, now just a slab of concrete under the kitchen. But the most striking difference was a long, narrow room marked only with the initials MD at the far end of the east wing, directly adjacent to the sealed space I had grown fixated on. MD, Margaret Durnham? A name I had not seen before, and one that did not appear in any of the official records. Curious, I returned to the locked archives I had inventoried my first week, the cabinets filled with family legal documents, property deeds, bank records, and other paperwork dating back to the early 1900s, and began searching for any sign of Margaret. At first, there was nothing. No birth certificate, no mention in census files or school records, nothing in the will, and not even in Silas's journals. But then, in a stack of loose estate letters from the 1930s, I found an envelope addressed to a Margaret Durnham at the estate itself, written in a child's handwriting, stamped but never sent. The letter inside was heartbreaking, a single sentence repeated over and over again in shaky pencil. "Please let me out, I'll be good. Please let me out, I'll be good." And at that moment the room around me felt like it sank into the floor, the silence pressing against my ears like altitude sickness, as if the house had suddenly realized I had seen too much. I gripped the paper tightly, the repetition on the page vibrating with desperation so pure I could feel it in my teeth, and I knew then that Margaret wasn't a forgotten relative or a lost memory. She was the center of it all, the truth buried in this home like bone beneath floorboards. I began looking not just for records, but for her voice, her proof. And that's when the house began to resist me. Not in a supernatural way, but emotionally, psychologically. Like each door I opened took something from me in return, as though the silence was retaliating against intrusion. I noticed the drafts first, cold current of air that seemed to come from nowhere, especially around the east wing and near the fireplaces. Then there were the sounds, small, subtle, but consistent. The creak of floorboards when I wasn't moving, the soft click of a hinge of a room I had just left, and worst of all, the tapping, rhythmic and precise, always behind. Walls, never above or below, just behind, like fingers against plaster, sometimes long and deliberate, sometimes fast and panicked. I began placing my ear to the walls, convincing myself it was old plumbing or animals nesting in crawl spaces. But deep down I knew better. I knew these weren't natural sounds. They were patterned, human, or had once been echoes, maybe not supernatural but residual, embedded in the very architecture of the estate by time and repetition. I started mapping the sounds, marking down where I heard each noise and at what time, and I noticed something eerie. The tapping was always strongest near the sealed room and moved in a circular path, like it was pacing around an interior space that no longer officially existed. That discovery led me to the blueprints again, this time comparing multiple versions from different decades, and I realized the estate had been slowly altered, one renovation at a time, to erase Margaret's presence, not all at once, but in pieces, like someone trying to unwrite a person from history without alerting the world of the erasure. The hallways were narrowed, rooms absorbed by others, doors walled over, staircases collapsed and sealed beneath concrete. Even her name was scrubbed from the official family tree. Her absence, so complete it was like she never existed. And yet she had. She had drawn, written, cried, and begged to be let out, and someone had gone to great lengths to silence that plea, the emotional weight of these. Realizations began to take a toll on me, not just mentally but physically. I stopped sleeping through the night, waking instead in cold sweats, my dreams filled with narrow rooms and tiny windows too high to reach. My appetite dwindled, my reflections in the antique mirrors looked thinner, haunted, and every time I looked at the sealed door, I felt a pulsing pressure in my chest, like I was standing in the presence of something sacred and profane all at once. I couldn't focus on anything else. Not eating, not reading, not even cataloging. And the isolation became a kind of companion, one I no longer feared but felt drawn to, as if loneliness itself were the currency required to unlock the house's final secrets. I stopped leaving the estate altogether. The idea of stepping outside the gates or driving back into town feeling pointless, empty, irrelevant. The outside world didn't understand what this place was, what it held, and I began to feel that it was my responsibility, perhaps, even my purpose, to preserve its truth, to unravel the silence and give voice to whoever had been buried beneath it. One day, while inspecting the baseboards of the East Wing hallway, I found what appeared to be a false panel. So small it would be easy to miss unless you were already obsessed, already broken open by curiosity and grief. I pried it loose with a chisel and flashlight and discovered a narrow passageway, barely wider than my shoulders, descending diagonally into the foundation of the house. The air was thick, stale, and smelled of mold and rust, but I entered without hesitation, crawling into the dark like a creature returning to its womb. And the moment my hands touched the cold stone of the hidden corridor, I knew I was on the path to Margaret, to her truth, and that I would follow it to whatever end awaited me. Even if that end was the same silence she had once begged to escape, and I spent the next 3 days in that narrow, hidden corridor beneath the East Wing. Not continuously, of course, but in repeated, methodical returns, my flashlight guiding the way each time as I inched deeper into the earth below the Durnham estate, crawling through a space that seemed designed not for movement, but for confinement, its walls close enough to scrape my shoulders, its ceiling so low I had to bend forward the neck like a penitent in prayer. Each time I descended, I brought tools, measuring tape, notepad, voice recorder, even a small digital camera, though the photos never captured what I saw, only darkness framed by warped stone. The passage was carved from the original foundation. I could tell that much. It wasn't part of any blueprint, and its construction was crude but intentional. Narrow artery cut into the estate like a vein meant to drain its secrets away from the light. At the end of it, 23 feet in by my estimate, I found something that changed everything. A small iron door, child-size, with a sliding panel at eye level and a rusted latch bolted shut from the outside, its hinges coated in a powdery mix of corrosion and time, as if it hadn't been opened in decades. I didn't open it that first day. In fact, I couldn't, not immediately, because the sight of it sent a cold shock through my spine, not out of fear, but out of recognition, like I had seen it before in a dream or in the drawings found beneath the floorboards, that same little girl with the clocks and no hands, standing before a dark rectangle carved into stone. Instead, I sat there, hunched in the dirt with my back against the wall, flashlight trembling in my palm, and I tried to imagine what it would be like to live on the other side of that door, not for hours or days, but for years forgotten by the world, preserved by silence, and still possibly remembered only by the architecture that had conspired to hide you. The next morning I opened it, the bolt snapping with a reluctant groan, and I found a room no larger than a janitor's closet, its walls lined with faded wallpaper depicting trees and stars, the kind meant to soothe children, though now it was peeling and brittle, the patterns distorted by moisture and decay. There was a small bed frame, rusted through and bent, its mattress long since rotted away, and on the far wall, etched into the plaster by what I assume were fingernails or a dull object, was a name written over and over again. Margaret, 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 some with hearts, some underlined, some scratched so deep the wall had splintered. I sat there for hours, unable to move, reading her name as if it were a scripture, the repetition of it vibrating through me like a confession, a call, a memory trying to survive against everything determined. To erase it. I didn't cry, not then. But I felt something close to mourning, the kind that doesn't explode but expands, filling every inch of your chest until breathing becomes an act of defiance. That night, I dreamt of her for the first time not as a presence but as a person. I saw a girl, 7 or 8, seated cross-legged on a stone floor, holding a ragged book in her lap, and staring up at a vent in the ceiling that filtered light in crooked slats. She didn't speak, didn't cry, just stared, blinking slowly. And when I woke, I could still feel the dampness of the stone beneath her and the weight of silence pressing down like a ceiling too low to stand beneath. I spent the next week in research, hunting for any trace of Margaret Durnham, because now I had proof, of physical space, tangible evidence. And yet still no record of her life beyond that hidden cell, no birth certificate, no photographs, nothing in public archives or church records. And when I contacted the local registrar, under the pretense of genealogical inquiry, I received a polite but definitive answer. There was no one named Margaret Durnham registered in the county during the years I suspected she would have been born. I considered that maybe she had been adopted or illegitimate or hidden for reasons more complex than cruelty. But then I found a ledger in the West Study, a financial journal of Silas's handwritten expenses, dated meticulously over decades, and there, buried between entries for coal, shipments and food deliveries, was a regular line item labeled M, followed by notations like books, sewing kit, milk, candles, linens, and even physician visit private. The entries appeared monthly, sometimes twice, from 1932 to 1946, after which they abruptly stopped. I stared at those dates, calculating backwards. If Margaret was 6 or 7 in 1932, she would have been around 21 in 1946. The year the expenses ceased, the same year Silas's journal abruptly skipped 6 months of entries. Something happened in 1946, something final, and whether it was death escape or transition into some other kind of captivity, I couldn't yet tell. I became obsessed, driven not just by curiosity, but by a need to speak for her, to lift her voice from the grave her family built from walls and silence. I went to the county library, pored over newspapers, death notices, missing persons reports, anything from that year that might hint at a woman vanishing or appearing, but nothing fit, no puzzle pieces snapped into place. And yet the feeling remained that she had not died in that room, that her story didn't end in that stone cell, not yet. The deeper I dug, the more I saw the subtle genius of Silas Durnham's erasure. He didn't just hide his daughter, he removed the world's ability to remember her, deleting her existence not through force but through omission, a masterclass in passive cruelty that chilled me more than any act of abuse could have. He had money, influence, and a home designed like a labyrinth of forgetting, and through those tools he crafted a silence so complete it endured beyond his own death. And yet there were cracks, fractures in the narrative that he couldn't completely seal. Like the journal pages tore at the edges, the odd receipts, the child's handwriting on old letters addressed but never sent, and most of all, the room itself too real to deny, too intimate to be anything but hers. I stopped referring to her as Margaret Durnham in my notes and started writing him instead, as if I were protecting her identity from the same forces that had once tried to erase it, and in doing so I felt closer to her, like a guardian, a witness, someone obligated not just to discover the truth, but to carry it forward, to resurrect her from history's deliberate forgetting. I returned to the room beneath the estate every evening now, not to investigate, but to sit, to listen, to feel, to imagine the long hours she spent there and how it must have shaped her mind, her view of the world, her belief in whether she deserved to be seen, loved, remembered. And I began to understand that the real horror wasn't the room itself, but the world that allowed it to exist unnoticed, the neighbors who never asked questions, the officials who never searched, the family members who said nothing, and the decades of silence that stretched like a noose across generations. In that understanding, Something inside me shifted, not broken, not yet, but reshaped, rewired, as if my soul had been realigned to a new magnetic field, one that pointed not north, but toward a truth still buried beneath this house, waiting to be found, waiting to be heard. The day I finally broke through the plaster concealing the east wing sealed door, I wasn't prepared for what I'd find. Truthfully, I don't think anything could have prepared me for it. Because even after weeks of cataloging, patterns, listening to walls, crawling through hidden corridors, and sleeping less than 3 hours a night, a part of me still believed that what lay beyond that wall would be more metaphor than fact, more suggestion than reality. But the truth was harder, heavier, and irreversibly human. I had spent nearly a week preparing, documenting every measurement, noting every creak and shift of the wall, and on the 7th morning, with a crowbar, a chisel, and hands that trembled more from anticipation and fear, I began peeling back history layer by layer, the plaster flaking off in thick, reluctant slabs that fell like chunks of skin from a body long dead, but still resisting dissection. And as I dug deeper, I uncovered a thick wooden door without a handle, its grain warped by moisture and time, the frame reinforced with iron bands that hadn't seen daylight in decades. It took 2 hours to fully clear it, and when I finally pulled it open, the hinges moaned like something, exhaling for the first time in 90 years, releasing a breath that smelled of mold, dust, and something sickly sweet, like decayed fabric or dry blood pressed in the grain of floorboards for too long. The room behind it was dark, pitch black at first, but as my flashlight flickered to life and swept across the space, I realized it wasn't a room in the traditional sense, not bedroom or storage area or forgotten corridor. It was a chamber, almost surgical in its dimensions, with walls padded, not for comfort, but for containment, the kind used in facilities that prioritize silence over safety. The padding was gray, water-stained, and torn in places, revealing old insulation beneath that crumbled like ash when touched. In the center was a bed frame, bolted to the floor, its mattress long rotted away, and above it, a single light bulb socket that had long since gone dead, its cord snipped at the base like someone had deliberately severed illumination from the room entirely. The floor was concrete, stained in irregular shapes that suggested water damage at first, but, upon closer inspection, held a reddish tint in places that made my stomach tighten. Not fresh, but old, oxidized into the stone itself. Against one wall was a small bookshelf, only 2 tiers, filled with children's books too brittle to open without disintegrating, and on the lowest shelf, tucked between 2 warped volumes of fairy tales, was a stuffed rabbit, white once, but now the yellow-colored teeth, its left eye missing and a seam torn open along its side. I picked it up and nearly dropped it when I heard a faint jingle from inside, something mechanical shifting with the movement, and when I pressed the plush body, a music box began to play, soft and warped, like a lullaby filtered through years of damp memory, and then layered beneath the music. I heard a child's voice, a girl's, speaking not to me, but into the past, a recorded loop that had somehow survived the years. I'm still here. I'm still here. I'm still here. Repeated 3 times before the voice dissolved into static and the melody wound down into silence. I stood frozen. The rabbit clutched to my chest, and the full weight of the truth hit me like a physical blow. This room had not just been sealed. It had been erased, entombed, and someone had gone to unthinkable lengths to ensure that whatever happened inside it would remain buried. But this rabbit, this voice, this moment was a rupture in that silence, and it shattered something. Inside me so completely I fell to my knees and wept. Not in horror, but in grief, not for myself, but for the child who had once whispered into a toy because it was the only thing listening. I didn't sleep that night, didn't eat, didn't leave the room for hours, choosing instead to sit in the center of it with a notebook on my lap, recording everything, not just the items, but the feelings, the weight, the air that seemed to carry the echoes of footsteps long gone. I ran my hands over the padded walls and felt grooves, deep and erratic, like someone had scratched at them repeatedly over years, trying to escape or trying to feel something beneath the silence. And on the far wall, hidden behind a panel I dislodged accidentally, I found a series of tick marks, dozens, maybe hundreds, scratched into the wood in rows of 5, a child's attempt to track time, to count days, to create order in a place designed to suppress it. I began photographing everything, documenting it with the precision of an archivist and the reverence of a mourner, because I knew now what this was: not a prison, not a sick room, not a punishment. It was a burial ground for a living child, a place where Margaret had been confined not because she was dangerous, but because she had been inconvenient, unfit for the public image Silas Durnham had crafted, and possibly afflicted with a condition he neither understood nor tolerated. The journal pages I found next confirmed as much. Beneath the mattress base, wrapped in wax paper, were 6 entries in childish handwriting, each one starting with "Dear Daddy" and ending with "Please," to be allowed out, to be held, to have the lights turned on, to hear someone's voice, even for just a minute. The final entry read simply, "I promise not to cry anymore. Please don't forget I'm real," and I could barely bring myself to copy it into my notes. This wasn't horror fiction. This wasn't a story for campfires or documentaries. This was real, flesh-and-bone cruelty, and it demanded more than attention. It demanded witness. I began revisiting the journals from Silas, reading them not for content but for absence, for what he chose not to write, and I noticed something stunning. In the years between 1933 and 1946, he never once referred to the East Wing, never mentioned home repairs in that quadrant, and in fact, deliberately excluded it from any reference. As if by omission, he could deny its very existence, and yet financial records show consistent purchases of insulation, soundproofing materials, and private physician fees, all marked under coded entries like MS or interior renovation. I pieced together a timeline and a pattern emerged. Margaret had likely been sealed in that room by age 6 or 7, kept there through adolescence, with minimal care and absolute isolation, and then, in 1946, everything stopped. No more purchases, no more journal entries, no more mentions of the child in any form. What happened then, I didn't yet know, but the evidence now pointed to something far worse than neglect. This had been sustained, institutionalized cruelty, hidden in plain sight behind the decorum of family name and the architecture of a house built to forget. I stared at the rabbit for a long time that night, replaying the voice over and over again, each time feeling the emotional scar tissue of that room press deeper into me, and I knew that whatever came next, whatever answers I uncovered or didn't, I could never unsee what I'd seen, never unknow what I now carried. Margaret's voice, barely whisper through time, repeating not to frighten, not to haunt, but to remind the world that she had existed, she had endured, and she had not been erased, not completely. Not yet. I spent the following days consumed not just by the room or by Margaret, but by the mind of the man who had built her prison, a mind I had up until that point only understood through omissions, financial records, and architectural secrets. But now, as I delved deeper into the attic storage, through trunks of correspondence and meticulously labeled boxes of manuscripts, I began to uncover the doctrine that had shaped Silas Durnham's every cruel decision, a doctrine so coldly intellectualized it disguised itself as logic, as belief, as a philosophy of control dressed up in paternal love. It started with a collection of personal essays, typed on yellowed paper and bound crudely with string, labeled the Durnham Method, on mental clarity and the preservation of moral order, and as I read the first paragraph, I felt my skin crawl with the calm precision of the voice, a tone that sought not to persuade but to inform, as if the contents were self-evident truths only the ignorant fail to grasp. In it, Silas wrote about mental deviation as a sickness of environment rather than biology, describing children as mirrors of their surroundings, and positing that emotional expression was not merely undisciplined but dangerous, an infection passed from mother to child, especially in cases where the mother succumbed to hysterical thought, a phrase he used repeatedly in reference to Margaret's mother, whose name, I now realize, had never once appeared in any document, photograph, or journal. He had erased her completely, blamed her invisibly, and in doing so, created a convenient scapegoat for whatever traits he deemed impure in his daughter. The essays became more disturbing as they progressed, shifting from cold theory to meticulous case studies of corrective isolation, citing unnamed examples, clearly Margaret, as successful experiments in emotional recalibration through sensory deprivation and moral silence. He described the construction of the quiet room as a sanctuary of ordered thought, and praised the effectiveness of prolonged isolation on diminishing what he called erratic feminine sensitivities, going so far as to say, after the 3rd week without language, the child begins to self-regulate, to understand the natural hierarchy of thought, free from contamination. I nearly vomited reading it, The clinical detachment of his words like a scalpel dissecting empathy out of the human soul. And what horrified me most wasn't just the content. It was the structure, the logic, the consistency with which he outlined his beliefs, as though he had built his morality brick by brick atop the suffering of a child, never once considering that suffering to be real. I found letters next, private correspondence with a man named Dr. Edwin Pelham, a physician, whose name did appear once in Silas's old receipts, and whose replies were filled with disturbing affirmations of Silas's theories, offering adjustments in diet, posture control, and light exposure for maximum psychological temperance, including the chilling phrase, "The child will resist, of course, but if kept from social stimuli, her spirit will cease its rebellion." These were not fringe beliefs held in isolation. Silas had surrounded himself, if not physically then intellectually, with men who reinforced his doctrine, who provided the pseudo-scientific backbone for his atrocities, and I realized that Margaret's prison had not been born of madness, but a conviction, the worst kind of cruelty, intentional, principled, self-righteous. The more I read, the more I saw the house differently, not just as a structure of secrecy, but as a physical embodiment of his ideology. The narrowed hallways as expressions of behavioral funneling, the soundproof walls as moral shields against emotional contagion, the sealed mirrors as rejections of self-recognition, all crafted to preserve a world where only his version of order could survive. And as that awareness dawned, I felt myself slipping, not in the way one loses grip on sanity, but in the way one begins to question whether one's own morality is strong enough to withstand the pull of another's narrative, because the writing was persuasive in the most dangerous way. It mirrored my own past, my own childhood of silence and obedience and punishment repackaged as discipline, and I began to see flickers of myself in the sentences, echoes of rules once taught to me by foster parents, teachers, institutions that valued order above understanding. I recoiled from that mirror, horrified not just by what I was reading, but by how close I had come to sympathize with its form, if not its substance. I fled the attic that night, unable to breathe beneath the weight of his voice, and spent hours in the cellar drinking from an old bottle of wine I found tucked behind the shelves, the bitter burn in my throat the only thing anchoring me to the present. I kept hearing her voice in the rabbit. "I'm still here. I'm still here." And I couldn't help but imagine her whispering those words in the dark while her father sat upstairs typing about purity of mind and the dangers of emotional contamination. I imagined her hands against the padded wall, counting the scratches, making her marks, trying to prove she existed in a world that had decided she didn't. And I made a vow then, slurred and shaking but solemn nonetheless. I would not let this doctrine stand, not untouched, not unexposed. I would burn it into the world if I had to, drag every page into daylight and force it to be known, not for closure, because there would never be closure, but for reckoning, the kind that silences never grant willingly. The next morning, hungover and hollow, I began transcribing the documents, scanning pages, photographing annotations, building a case against a dead man, not in court but in memory, where it mattered most. And as I worked, I began to see Margaret's story not just as a tragedy, but as a resistance, a quiet defiance against the man who tried to erase her and against the world that allowed him to do it. Every tick mark on her wall, every plea scrawled in a child's hand, every echo preserved in fabric and dust and silence. It was all proof that she had not gone quietly, that she had fallen the only way she could, and that her story, even in fragments, was enough to shatter the illusion of righteousness her father built around himself. Silas Durnham had written hundreds of pages to explain away his cruelty, to justify it, intellectualize it, immortalize it. But all it took to destroy it was a girl's voice and a toy and the whisper of 5 scratched lines in plaster, repeated, relentless. Human. I did not notice the shift at first. It was subtle, incremental, like water wearing down stone. A soft erosion of the boundaries I once kept between the subject I was studying and the self who studied it. I had become entangled in it, embedded in it, swallowed whole by its quiet demands, and whatever separation once existed between their story and mine had begun to dissolve. It started with my routine slipping, meals forgotten, sleep avoided not just out of obsession, but from the sheer inability to rest in a place so thick with suppressed suffering. The house had stopped being architecture and had become a presence, not supernatural, not haunted, but emotionally sentient in the way a tomb holds. Memory, heavy and inescapable. I found myself walking the halls barefoot at night, whispering Margaret's name without realizing it, repeating in a rhythm like prayer, as if by speaking it over and over, I could summon something: clarity, peace, maybe even forgiveness for having arrived too late to save her. I began reenacting her possible routines based on what I had found. Sitting for hours in the padded room beneath the east wing, staring at the ceiling with a rabbit in my lap, measuring the light that filtered through the cracks, counting out loud in sets of 5 the way her tick marks suggested she had done, eating only when my stomach demanded it, isolated myself in the world to feel what she had felt, to understand her not through intellect but through immersion. And somewhere in that effort I began a fracture, not in sudden, dramatic ways, but in slow bleedings of the self. I caught myself writing in her voice in my journal, not quoting her, but as her, penning letters, addressed to Daddy that I knew she had never been allowed to send, filling pages with apologies and promises I fabricated just to hear how they sounded, as if I could ghostwrite her grief into something that might finally be heard. I stopped answering calls, deleted my email account, let my phone battery die, and never charged it again, because none of it mattered. There was only this house, this girl, this truth wrapped in plaster and ideology and dust. I dreamed of her every night now, but the dreams had changed. No longer was she a passive presence watching me from corners, but a guiding one, leading me through hallways that didn't exist, showing me doors I hadn't noticed, whispering secrets and voices I couldn't understand but felt compelled to follow. I would wake in the middle of the night, standing in places I didn't remember walking to, the attic, the cellar, the narrow corridor behind the paneling, once even waking on the floor of the padded room with my hand resting on the stuffed rabbit's head as if I had been comforting it. I started hearing things, not voices, but the echo of sounds I had once discovered and dismissed, the tapping behind the walls, now louder, more rhythmic, like breathing with purpose. The creaking floorboards no longer felt like settling wood, but like footsteps just ahead of me, always around the corner, never seen. I told myself it was just stress, just the isolation, but deep down I knew I was no longer just an archivist uncovering the truth. I had become a vessel for it, my identity rewritten by the house's need confessed through me. I stopped wearing my own clothes, opting instead for garments I found in the old chests, hand-stitched cotton shirts that smelled faintly of cedar and mothballs, because it made me feel closer, more immersed, more part of the narrative I was curating. My reflection began to change too, not physically, but perceptually, when I passed by the few uncovered mirrors left in the house. I sometimes failed to recognize myself, the man looking back too hollow-eyed, too thin, too much like someone who had lost time and purpose in favor of obsession. I began referring to the sealed room as her room, not the cell, not the chamber, and would speak aloud to her whenever I entered, describing what I had discovered, what I had written, what I planned to uncover next. Sometimes I imagined she responded, not audibly, but in the shifting weight of the air, the way light curved strangely in the corner, the sudden thud of a book falling in a distant room at the exact moment. I asked if she was listening. I no longer believed in coincidence. I no longer cared if anyone else did. The line between empathy and madness had thinned to a filament, and I walked it willingly. Convinced that to truly honor her, I had to feel her story not as a researcher, but as a participant, a witness from within. I constructed a timeline on the walls of the library, mapping her life in yarn and pushpins, connecting financial entries to journal excerpts to architectural changes, filling the gaps with speculative notations written in red ink, whole sections labeled the forgotten years, or M's education by isolation, and I began to narrate it to myself as I worked, sometimes for hours, pacing back and forth like a lecturer in an empty lecture hall, reciting the history of a girl the world had never officially acknowledged but who now lived inside every sentence I spoke. I stopped shaving, opening the blinds, kept the house lit only by the old gas lanterns and dim chandeliers, trying to maintain the atmosphere as it had been in the 1930s and 40s, as if breaking the illusion would break the connection, the communion I had established with her memory. And then came the recordings. I began reading her letters aloud, transcribing them into audio logs, speaking in the voice I imagined she might have used, then responding as Silas, not to mimic him but to confront him, to force his words into dialogue with the grief they had caused. It was a strange theater of truth and guilt, and I played both roles until I no longer knew which one I inhabited more fully. I knew I was losing myself. I felt in a way I no longer longed for the outside world, no longer wondered what day it was, no longer considered my own name important. Samuel Thorne had been a man who cataloged artifacts. Now, I was becoming the artifact, the last living piece of Margaret's story, the only voice left, willing to carry the unbearable weight of her forgotten years. I told myself this was noble, necessary, justifiable, but in the deepest recesses of my heart, I knew I was addicted, not to the horror, but to connection, the intimacy of knowing someone no one else had ever tried to know, of holding grief so long denied that it fossilized into something sacred. And as I lay on the floor of her room one night, eyes open to the ceiling she must have stared at for thousands of hours, I whispered into the dark, "You're not alone." And for the first time, I felt that maybe neither was I. It was during one of my evening rituals, wandering the library with a candle in hand, tracing the yarn lines of Margaret's timeline across the wall like a pilgrim reading scripture, that I discovered a compartment, hidden behind the lower panels of the built-in bookshelf beneath the west-facing window, a section of molding slightly warped, just enough for the edge of the candle flame to flicker differently as I passed. I pressed on it instinctively, and it gave with a hollow thunk, revealing a narrow cavity stuffed with cloth-wrapped objects layered in dust so fine it clung to my fingertips like old ash. My heart pounded as I pulled the cloth back to reveal 6 reel-to-reel audio tapes stacked neatly atop one another, each labeled in fading ink. Session 1, Observation. Session 2, Vocal Response. Session 3, Silence Conditioning. And so on, all the way to the final one, simply marked M, Final, with a date from early 1946, a date that haunted my research as the point at which all records of Margaret vanished completely. I stood there for what felt like an hour, the tapes cradled in my arms, afraid to breathe too hard lest I disrupt the fragile air of truth that now surrounded me. These were no longer just artifacts. They were her voice, her proof, and possibly the final record of her existence. I set up the reel-to-reel player I had found earlier in the attic, an old Akai machine that groaned as I wound the tape and powered on, the motor humming to life like a reluctant ghost. And as the first recording began, the sound of static filled the room, broken by the scratchy voice of a man I had never heard aloud but knew intimately. Silas Durnham, methodical, controlled, speaking with the detached precision of a scientist cataloging a specimen, announcing, "Subject, M. Durnham, female, age 9. Observation Session 1. Subject is nonverbal by choice. Vocal stimulation attempted through music. Limited effect observed. Then came the sound of movement, the soft creak of what must have been a padded chair in her cell, followed by silence so long it made the air feel heavy, until suddenly a soft humming began, not Silas, but Margaret, her voice delicate and uncertain, humming a nursery tune that I recognized from the music box inside the stuffed rabbit. My throat closed around itself as I listened, as she repeated the melody 3 times, before falling quiet, the tape continuing with nothing but the ticking of an unseen clock and Silas's quiet breathing before he ended the recording. I sat frozen, tears welling not from horror, but from the intimacy of hearing her, not as a concept or a name on a wall, but as a child, alive and struggling, finding comfort in song while being studied like an animal. The second tape was worse. Session 2, Vocal Response, where Silas attempts to provoke her into speech using emotional stimuli, asking questions in a gentle but coercive tone. "Do you miss your mother?" Followed by a pause and, "You don't need to cry." Crying is a symptom of weak will. And then Margaret's small voice, hesitant, whispering, "Please, let me out, please," before being cut off by Silas's sharp interjection. "No pleading. We're learning to be strong." I wanted to destroy the tape, to rip it apart with my bare hands, but I forced myself to listen, to absorb, because turning away would make me just another custodian of silence. Each recording escalated. Session 3 introduced silence intervals, where Margaret was left alone for long stretches, her voice only appearing in sobs or murmured questions to no one, until Session 4, where there was no vocalization at all, just breathing, pacing, a faint rhythmic knock against the wall, likely her fingernails counting time, and Silas narrating her reactions with terrifying calm, saying things like, "Subject demonstrates improved compliance through spatial restriction," as if the complete collapse of Childs were a therapeutic success. By the 5th tape, her presence was almost spectral, faint, whispering at the edge of hearing, responding to Silas's prompts with simple yes or no answers, and once, heartbreakingly whispering, "I'll be better," over and over as he praised her cooperation, a word that rang like a blade in my ears. I could barely breathe by the time I placed the sixth and final reel on the player, marked M Final, my hand shaking as I adjusted the knob and pressed play. And at first there was only static, then silence, longer than any previous tape. So long that I thought it might be blank, until the sound of the chair creaking returned, followed by Silas's voice. Not calm this time, but shaky, uncertain, murmuring, "She's gone. She's gone," as though in disbelief, and then the sound of something falling, papers, maybe a tray, followed by footsteps pacing a tight circle, then a strange thing. Silence again, but it wasn't empty. It was full charged, like the silence of a room after someone screams. Then Silas's voice returned, low and strained, whispering, "She left me. I made her perfect, and she left me." And I felt a cold dread bloom inside me, a dread not of murder or violence, but of loss, not his but hers, the final evidence that she had either escaped or died, and he hadn't expected it, hadn't planned for it, which meant she'd act alone, had fought back in the only way she could, disappearing. The tape ended with Silas sobbing, not loudly, but with a broken rhythm, like someone unable to accept the collapse of their own delusion, and in that moment, I understood something horrific and beautiful. Margaret had survived him, even if only briefly, even if only in the act of defiance, in choosing not to be his experiment any longer, and whether she died that day or vanished into the world beyond, she had reclaimed herself in a way he couldn't control. I fell on my knees and cried, not for her death, but for her escape, for the courage it must have taken to face whatever darkness lay beyond that door with nothing but the hope of being free. I spent the rest of the night replaying the tapes, digitizing them, creating transcripts, logging every second into an archive I titled the Durnham Confession. Because that's what they were, not scientific studies or therapeutic sessions, but confession of cruelty preserved in magnetic tape, a legacy of suffering rendered audible, and I vowed again, more fiercely than ever, that I would not let these tapes remain hidden, that her voice, soft, small, and nearly erased, would be amplified, made unignorable, because she had spoken, she had sung, she had begged and resisted and finally vanished, and now, through me, she would be remembered. I began recording my own voice the morning after I finished cataloging the tapes, not because I thought anyone would listen, not because I expected the world to care, but because I needed to say it out loud, to hear myself speak the truths that had lived too long behind walls and beneath floors, truths pressed into concrete and softened wallpaper, etched into bed frames and stuffed animals, the kind of truths that dissolve the longer they're left unspoken. I sat in the library, the same room where Silas Durnham had once transcribed his vile doctrine, and I placed the old reel-to-reel beside me, this time not a play but a capture, to record something that wasn't manipulation or silence, but mourning, confrontation, grief, and apology. I pressed record and said my name slowly, Samuel Thorne, then paused, the air around me feeling denser than usual, like the house itself was listening, waiting to hear whether I betray it or redeem it, and I continued, "This is not about me. This is about Margaret Durnham, a child erased by her own blood." My voice broke on her name, not because it was unfamiliar, but because I had spoken it so often now it felt sacred, like a prayer carved into my throat. And I went on, explaining everything, from the letter that first brought me here to the sealed room, the hidden corridor, the drawings, the rabbit, the tapes, the journals, the doctrine, the cell. I narrated it all in one breathless sweep, stopping only when I felt myself slipping into tears. And even then I kept the recorder on, because pain was part of the testimony, part of what had to be preserved. Not just facts, but feeling, not just evidence, but empathy. I confessed everything, not just the discoveries, but the unraveling, the obsession, the hallucinations, the sleeplessness, the way the house had rewritten my routines, my sense of time, my understanding of self. I spoke of how I had begun to live through her, how her silence had become a sound inside me I couldn't silence, how every step I took in that estate felt like trespassing on a graveyard built for one, how even now I couldn't say for certain whether Margaret had died in that room or escaped into a world too uncaring to notice her freedom. I recorded every letter she had written, transcribed each word from the rabbit's lullaby, described her tick marks, her drawings, her final plea. "Please don't. Forget I'm real. And I said into the mic, I won't. I never will. And now neither will anyone else. Because I knew then that the only way to honor her wasn't to keep this as a private horror or family shame, but to drag it into the light, to let it breathe even if it stank of death and despair. I created a website, uploaded the audio files, the transcripts, the photographs of the sealed room, the tapes, the drawings, the documents, even the architectural plans that showed how the house had been deliberately altered to contain and conceal her existence. I published my findings as a digital archive titled Inside the Durnham Estate. The truth buried for 93 years, and attached a long open letter, my confession, my apology, and my hope that anyone would listen not just to me but to her. I sent it to newspapers, academic institutions, trauma researchers, human rights organizations, even child advocacy groups, most of whom never responded or replied with polite thanks and nothing more. But I kept pushing, kept sending, kept calling, because every day that passed without Margaret's story being heard felt like another day she was locked in that room. I reached out to the Historical Society, scheduled an appointment with a preservation official, and when they visited the estate, I showed them everything, guided them through the hidden corridor, the padded cell, the tapes, the timelines, even let them hold a rabbit if they dared, and though they said little, I saw in their faces the way their eyes darted, the way they clutched, their notebooks tighter, that this was no longer just history, it was a reckoning. I met with lawyers next, unsure if I had the legal right to expose what I found, worried I'd be stopped, silenced, accused of defamation or trespassing or something equally bureaucratic. But instead they asked how I had survived the isolation, how I had documented it all so thoroughly, and whether I wanted to testify in the event this ever reached a court. I told them I didn't care about courts or headlines. I just wanted Margaret's voice to matter. They said that was noble, but the law didn't always reward nobility, and I understood then that truth was never guaranteed justice. But still, I persisted. I held a press conference, just me and 2 reporters who bothered to show up, on the lawn of the estate, the facade of the house looming behind me like a mausoleum, and I read aloud from Margaret's journal pages, played the recording of her voice in the rabbit, and ended with the line, "She wasn't a ghost. She was a girl, and this is her story." One reporter cried. The other looked away. Both asked questions I couldn't fully answer. Where was her body? Did she escape? Was there any official record of her existence? And I said what I had come to believe was the only truth. It doesn't matter. What matters is that she lived, and that someone tried to take that away from her, and that I won't let them. I expected backlash, disbelief, trolls accusing me of fabrication or attention-seeking or madness. But the truth is, most people didn't care enough to be angry. They simply clicked away, moved on, scrolled past a headline like it was a sad story in a sea of sad stories, and that indifference stung worse than outrage, because it confirmed my deepest fear, that Margaret had been silenced once by cruelty and now again by apathy. But still, I kept talking, kept writing, kept recording, because silence is a choice, and I was done choosing it. I wrote letters to Silas's remaining legal contacts, to any estate lawyer tied to the Durnham name, demanding they acknowledge the sealed room, the evidence, the loss, but no one responded, because they knew, or they didn't want to know, and in the end, it made no difference. The truth was out there now, and whether it was embraced or ignored, it was no longer hidden, no longer entombed beneath plaster and pride, and in the quiet moments, the ones, when the world didn't feel like it was listening, I returned to her room, sat on the cold stone floor with my back against the wall, and whispered to her the same words I had said in my first recording. You're not alone. You never were. And I promise they'll remember. The inquiry began not with a grand tribunal or televised scandal, but with a single email, a cold, formal response from the State Historical Commission acknowledging receipt of my submitted archive, a 3-line message that thanked me for my extensive documentation regarding potential historical abuse within the Durnham estate, and assured me that my materials would be reviewed in accordance with internal preservation protocols, which read more like a burial than a promise. I stared at the screen for a long time after reading it, not angry, just numb, because I had poured every fragment of my soul into uncovering a truth that bled from the walls of that house, a truth I had cradled like a dying bird and offered to the world with open hands. And the world had responded with automated bureaucracy, Still, the message had done something. It triggered a process, a paper trail, and within a week a local journalist picked up the archive, citing the rabbit recording as the most chilling and heartbreaking evidence of historical child confinement ever uncovered in a private residence. And from there the story began to trickle outward, not as a headline, but as a murmur. Academics wrote think pieces. Child advocacy groups issued carefully worded statements, and podcasts speculated on what might happen to Margaret Durnham after the tape stopped recording. But for every voice that rose in concern, there were 5 that whispered disbelief, called the evidence inconclusive, the confession melodramatic, and the entire narrative a haunting but unverifiable account from a man too close to madness to be trusted. I watched as my credibility was dissected on forums, my voice analyzed for signs of instability, and the state itself reduced to a curiosity. A forgotten house now reopened not as a memorial, but as a spectacle. Tour companies began calling, asking if I would allow filming on-site. Ghost hunters offered money to spend a night in Margaret's room. And though I refused them all, I felt something inside me erode a little more each time, like watching a scar be repurposed as entertainment. Then came the investigators. First a local council, then representatives from historical preservation societies, and finally 2 federal agents assigned to explore allegations of prolonged unlawful confinement. Though by then the trail was too old, the evidence too circumstantial, and without a body or a birth certificate, Margaret remained a haunting footnote, not a victim recognized by law. They interviewed me extensively, asked about my background, my mental health, my motivations, my time in foster care, and I answered everything, calmly, honestly, even when it hurt, because I wasn't just defending my findings. I was defending her reality, her right to be remembered not as a myth, but as a girl with voice in a room and name scratched into the walls by her own hand. In the end, the inquiry concluded what I feared from the beginning. No conclusive evidence of criminal wrongdoing attributable to any surviving member of the Durnham family. Subject Margaret Durnham remains unverified due to lack of official documentation. The Durnham estate, while historically significant, contains no actionable evidence. I read that sentence over and over again, each time hoping it might change, that the words might morph into justice or acknowledgement or even regret, but they never did. The house remained mine, the legacy untouched, and Margaret's story dismissed by the very institutions men uphold the memory of the lost. But something unexpected happened in the aftermath. Not in courtrooms or headlines, but in letters, emails, quiet visits from strangers who had read the archive or heard the recordings, and couldn't sleep afterward. They came from all over, teachers, nurses, retired social workers, even a few survivors of institutional abuse who recognized in Margaret's silence a mirror of their own, and they came not for answers but to say, "Thank you," or "I believe you," or "She mattered." One woman in her 60s drove 3 hours just to stand outside the state gates and leave a bouquet of wildflowers at the base of the iron fence, whispering, for the girl who kept count. Before returning to her car without a word, I began hosting private visits. Not tours, never tours, but quiet, guided walks through the East Wing, allowing only those who came with reverence, who had read every word and listened to every tape, and still chose to stand in the silence rather than fill with theories. Some cried, some prayed, some simply sat on the floor of her room and stared at the faded drawings she had left behind, the only gallery in the world that held her art, and in those moments, I felt something shift, not in the world, which continued largely unchanged, but in me, because for every person who truly listened, the silence loosened its grip just a little more. I created a foundation in her name, the Margaret Durnham Archive for Lost Children, a digital and physical space for stories like hers, undocumented, unresolved, unacknowledged, and began to grow, slowly, submissions trickling in from across the country, files of children who had slipped through systems, who had been buried by bureaucracy or shame or neglect, and though I couldn't prove each one, I archived them all because truth, I had learned, is not always legal, not always provable, but is always felt, and Margaret's truth had taught me that silence is not absence, it is oppression. I wrote to the Durnham estate attorneys one last time, not to demand anything, but to inform them that I would be converting part of the house into a private memorial and research center, open by appointment only, and that while I no longer sought validation, I would not allow the silence to resume. They never responded. And so I worked alone, renovating the east wing not with drywall and polish, but with care, preserving her room, sealing the rabbit in a glass case, mounting transcripts and photographs along the hallway like a timeline not a horror, but a resistance. And I ended the tour with a plaque that read, "She was not a myth. She was not a ghost. She was a child, and she counted every day she was alive." And every time I read that plaque aloud to a visitor, I saw their faces change, sometimes subtly, sometimes completely, but always with that same gravity, that same silent acknowledgement that somewhere, at some point, a terrible thing had happened, and someone had tried to forget it, but had survived in the most fragile way possible. Memory, ink, fabric, voice, and now, finally, the world was beginning to remember. IT was almost by accident that I found it. The final letter, the one that would answer nothing and yet explain everything. Not in the sealed room or in the attic or behind one of the dozens of panels I had pulled apart in search of secrets, but tucked inside an old phonograph cabinet in the music room, beneath a stack of brittle opera sleeves, in an envelope so faded its edges had fused with the fibers of the cabinet wood, requiring surgical patience to extract without tearing. I had been dusting the room in preparation for a visit from a former archivist who'd expressed interest in the acoustic history of the estate, and in that moment, my hands moved without thought, guided not by instinct but by the strange rhythm of obsession that had governed me since the first day I arrived. The envelope was addressed to Margaret Durnham, to be opened when she is ready, and there was no stamp, no address, just a name, written in a trembling hand I recognized instantly from Silas's journals, the careful, slanted print of a man who believed his every word to be sacred. And yet this letter felt different. It wasn't sealed with wax like his others, nor was it folded precisely, but rather creased and worn, as if handled many times before being hidden, perhaps even second-guessed. I sat on the edge of the piano bench, my breath caught in my chest, afraid to read it, afraid that it might unravel what little piece I had managed to reclaim from this long ordeal, but also knowing I could not turn away. Not now. Not after everything. I unfolded the single sheet and began to read. The ink faded but still legible, and what poured from the page was not a confession in the traditional sense, not an apology, not an explanation, but something stranger and more unsettling. A man trying to speak across time to the daughter he had buried alive not with shovels, but with silence. "Margaret," it began, "if you are reading this, then something is broken open. Either I have lost my nerve, or you have found your way through the veil I built for us, and in either case, I am both ashamed and relieved." He went on to describe, in agonizing detail, the evolution of his beliefs, how he had once considered emotion a contagion and silence a cure, but that over the years, the silence had begun to consume even him, devouring the logic he once trusted, until he could no longer tell whether the child he kept was real or a shadow of his own guilt. "You stopped speaking," he wrote, "and I began to forget the sound of your voice, and then, in time, I forgot my reasons for keeping you there at all. Only the ritual remained, the meals, the observations, a locked door, as though I had become a servant to a system I built and could no longer question." It was not remorse I read in his words, but a kind of fractured clarity, a dawning realization that by trying to mold her into stillness, he had lost her entirely, not just her body, which may have remained behind those walls, but her essence, her fire, her humanity. He wrote of dreams, of hearing her singing in rooms she had never entered, of her footsteps pacing above his study, of a child's laugh echoing down halls that had long gone quiet, and how he had begun to believe that perhaps silence had not tamed her, but freed her into something beyond his reach. And then the final lines, scrawled more hastily, as if written in panic or weakness. "I was wrong, Margaret, not about the danger of emotion, but about the danger of controlling it. I see now that what I feared in you was never illness, but independence. And by the time I realized it, you had already gone. I am sorry. I am sorry. I am sorry." There was no signature, no date, just those repeated words like an incantation, as though if he wrote them enough, they might find her, wherever she had gone, into death or into the world. It didn't matter, because for the first time, he had spoken not as a judge or a scientist or a father obsessed with order, but as a man unraveling under the weight of his own silence. I folded the letter and held it against my chest, and for the first time since arriving at the Durnham estate, I allowed myself To grieve, not just for her, but for him, for the boy he must have once been before the doctrine took root, before fear became scripture, and for the house itself, which had been born in grandeur but grown into a mausoleum of intention, a place where love was replaced by systems, and where the sound of a child's voice had become too dangerous to allow. I read the letter aloud in Margaret's room that evening, my voice steady, the words echoing softly against the padded walls, and when I finished, I placed it on the floor beside the rabbit and whispered. He knew. In the end, he knew. I didn't expect a response, didn't need one, because something in the room shifted. Not physically, but emotionally, as if the final piece had been laid down. The final word spoken in the story, though unfinished, could now rest, not in closure, but in recognition, in the simple truth that she had lived, that she had been heard, and that even her captor had finally spoken her name not as a subject or symbol, but as a daughter. And that, I realized, was more than most forgotten children ever receive. The Durnham estate is no longer a place of silence. It breathes now, slowly and solemnly, like an old body remembering how to move after too long paralyzed by grief. And though its walls still carry the weight of what they've held, that weight is no longer buried in darkness, but placed in the light with care, preserved not to be admired, but to be understood. I have become its caretaker not just by inheritance, but by transformation, because I am not the man who first walked through those iron gates with a letter in hand and a name he didn't recognize. I am something else now, something shaped by her story and by the burden of remembering what others worked so hard to forget. People visit the house not in droves, not with fanfare, but quietly, solemnly, by appointment, by invitation, by the kind of word of mouth that moves among the wounded and the searching. And when they come, I meet them at the door and explain, with soft conviction, that this is not a haunted house, not a monument to horror, but a testimony to the danger of silence and the resilience of those made small by it. I show them her room last, not because it is a centerpiece, but because it is the heart of the story, and I let them enter alone if they choose, let them sit on the padded floor, or read her final letter, or listen to her voice preserved in the rabbit's lullaby, and I do not speak while they do, because what she deserves now, more than anything, is to be heard. Outside, the grounds have been restored, not to their former grandeur, but to something gentler, a place of benches and wildflowers and a small engraved stone set beneath a young tree that reads simply, "To the girl who kept counting, you are remembered. I've planted that tree myself, watched it grow from a fragile stem to a living memorial, its roots pressing slowly into the same soil that once bore witness to her erasure. And each year I watch its branches reach a little higher, its leaves shake in the wind like tiny hands waving at the sky, and I feel something close to peace, not the kind that forgets, but the kind that lives alongside memory, like a scar you no longer hide. The house has changed me, not just in body. I've aged more in these past years than in any decade before it, but in soul, in the way I walk and think and listen, because I've learned that truth is rarely loud, rarely grand, rarely whole. It is quiet, fragmented, passed between walls and whispers and drawings and tapes buried beneath floorboards, and if we are not careful, if we are not vigilant, it slips away and takes with it the people who once held it. What stayed hidden behind the walls for 93 years wasn't just a child or a doctrine or a set of architectural lies. It was a voice, soft and steady, calling not for justice, not for vengeance, but for acknowledgement, for the right to exist in someone's memory. And now that voice speaks every day through the pages of her journal, through the recordings, through the very air of this state. And through me, I speak her name often, not as an act of mourning, but as a promise, Margaret Durnham. And each time I say it aloud, I feel her presence not as a ghost, but as a girl who lived, who was buried in silence and dug back out with words, with empathy, with time. She taught me that history is not what survived the fire. It is what the fire tries to erase and what someone someday chooses to save anyway. And so I live here now not as an heir, but as an archivist of grief, a steward of stories too painful for most to carry. And every time a visitor asks me what I found behind those walls, I answer them not with facts, but with simple truth. I found a girl who counted every day she was forgotten, and now we count them with her.